idea of how the banks stack up. Should those banks that have proven to be strong be allowed to repay TARP and wash their hands clean of the whole government nightmare situation? Our next guest is a congressman from New Jersey, and he says, quote, the federal government should allow banks that have made substantial changes and improvements to repay taxpayer dollars as soon as possible. Joining us for our first on Fox Business interview is Representative John Adler, Democrat of New Jersey. He is also on the Financial Services Committee. Welcome, sir. Thank you for being here.
Liz, thank you so much.
Well, you've written letters, you've made your voice heard on this. Tell us why you feel that banks that are healthy should immediately be able to repay TARP, and who's stopping them? We've heard some of the administration members say, go ahead, we're not stopping anybody.
Well, like most Americans, I come from a very middle-class background. To me, $700 billion is a lot of money. And to have the taxpayers have that much money out there to prop up banks is not very comfortable for me. I'd want the banks to pay their money back as soon as possible. I hate the idea that the government might actually discourage banks from paying back this money. I didn't support the TARP. It was a scary big amount of money for me. And I think the sooner we get that money back in the taxpayers' hands, the better we'll all be.
I agree with you, Representative, but when you talk about the stress test, you discuss, and apparently the way they looked at it was that they look at how much further we could fall into the abyss, and if things eroded further. This could just be sort of a balancing out and plateauing for a moment before we take a leg lower here. So I begin to question, well, what if banks that think they're healthy are still too close to the edge, and would that then make a problem if they paid back the money and then have to go back and ask for more?
Well, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I think capitalism has to have some winners and some losers along the way. I feel sorry for investors that didn't do well with their bank stock, but if some banks close, that's a risk that capitalism has to undertake. For those banks like Citi or Bank of America that are undercapitalized according to stress tests, I hope they go out to the private markets and get some venture capital money, get some private equity money, get some hedge fund money, and recapitalize that way. I hate to think that the stockholders are going to be the American taxpayers. I'd rather have private investors do what they do well, assess risk, put money in, recapitalize banks, and have banks go about the business of lending to creditworthy borrowers.
I'm with you 100%, Representative Adler. I absolutely feel that in a capitalistic society, you've got to let certain things fail. Warren Buffett said, hey, if banks aren't solid and on solid footing, they should fail. I mean, you know, you've heard Dave Ramsey here on Fox Business say, what is success anyway but standing on a pile of failure? So, yes, absolutely. So how is it that the administration, of which you are a part because you are a Democrat, seems to be wanting to put pillows down everywhere they think that a bank might fall?
Well, I'm not actually a constitutional scholar. I think Congress is a different branch of government than the White House and the executive branch of government. I could be wrong on this. I ran to represent my district and to help my country, and I think we should have the TARP money repaid so the taxpayers are better off. The taxpayers are not at risk in that way. I'm sorry if bondholders or stock owners are at risk, but that's the risk you take when you invest money.
Have you had a chance
I'm hoping
to,
the private sector steps in.
Have you had a chance to talk to Treasury Secretary Geithner, and do you get the sense that he's saying, no, you can't pay the money back yet?
I frankly have not talked to him on this topic, but I know, looking at what happened in the 1930s, and I know Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke is an expert on what happened in the 30s, some banks were allowed to fail. Some banks were propped up in a short term and turned around. A lot of banks were reopened after President Roosevelt closed the banks. I think President Obama is following that same pattern that President Roosevelt followed 60-some years earlier. It worked then, it'll work again, but it's going to mean some banks may have to fail in order for capitalism to do what it does well.
Do you think more of the TARP money, I think we don't know for sure, but about $100 billion or so left, do you think that should be spent, or should we keep that as dry powder?
Oh, I sure think just the opposite. I think that the TARP money should be repaid. You mentioned Goldman earlier in your report. Those banks and other entities that receive TARP money and they're doing well, that are fully capitalized, they should pay their money back now and have the taxpayer exposure minimized. If, in fact, we have to have the taxpayers at risk at all, it should be minimized as much as possible.
Definitely. Do you get the sense that there's going to be just too much spending? We have the omnibus spending bill. We've got the budget that our own Rich Edson just held up. I mean, the thing looked like a gigantic brick. It's so heavy. What worries you right now as we look ahead? Because if we've printed so much money and we're spending so much, at some point, don't we have to pay the piper?
Well, short term, I worry so much about businesses getting back on their feet and households where people want to work, have the ability to work, the will to work. making sure we have available American jobs, particularly in manufacturing that we've sort of declined over the last 30, 40 years. But long-term, absolutely, deficits and debt are a serious concern, and we have to, as soon as we get out of this recession, we have to tackle the growth of federal government spending, make sure that the federal government gets right